So today we're going to be looking at alternative story forms. Your assignment for this week is going to be to actually create an alternative story form. Unlike last week's assignment where I gave you the materials for this, you're actually going to be creating this based on a subject that you decide upon. So that's basically the gist of it. You'll get more information as we go. The purpose of this slideshow, for the most part, is just to kind of show you some examples of some. So I've got a little bit of detailed information about what an alternative story form is, and then after that, I'll just show you a whole series of professional and student examples. So the alternative story form, there's sort of two different kinds of this. It's really any kind of story that's not told in a textual sort of way. So not a traditional story. The two types that you'll find, one is where you might see a page that's a completely standalone alternative story form all by itself, where it's either a multiple series of alternative story forms kind of on the same subject, all put together graphically, or just one giant one that takes up the whole page. And the other side kind is the supplemental, which is a as it says, sort of an additional to a story that might already exist. So sort of a pop-in mod, sometimes you might think of this way. Here's an example of infrared reading scanning software that's used. These tests have been done for a while, where they basically kind of hook people's eyeballs up to a page and then get sort of a visual representation of what people are looking at the most. And it goes without saying, I think, that visuals often are much more read than just plain old text. So you can see here's an example just done based on a story. And you can see where the story is pretty highly read at the beginning, and then you start to lose readers as you go. And by the time you get to the bottom of that story, literally no one is reading. It's a little depressing, I suppose, if you're the person who wrote the story, to realize that not a single person probably got all the way through their story. But generally speaking, we kind of know how that goes. It's interesting to note, too, if you're talking about this with students, that the dripping pattern of the infrared light also matches up to the inverted pyramid. And so you can use this also as an example to kind of talk about why it's important to share the most important information first. When you look at this on a website, you can see where there's a big red dot on the person's face, and we're looking at the buttons, the remote buttons for controlling that video that were up in the upper right-hand corner, and then there's certain things on the page that people just don't even look at all. And then here's kind of an example of the same thing, only via someone's phone and an iPad, where you can see how some of these visuals are the things that people kind of key in on. Just some things that I think are important in terms of remembering that not everyone is going to look at every single thing on your page. Here are three examples of the same types of coverage done in three different ways. So if you look at the one on the left-hand side, it's a pretty straightforward, very text-heavy, basically two main stories. There's some visuals. It's not super boring or anything, but there isn't really anything graphic that goes with it. The middle choice, you're starting to see a combination of visuals and traditional text. And then the third choice you see is basically just alternative story form all the way through. There's nothing really on that page that would be considered a traditional story. The one that was read the most, and in fact 15% people paid 15% more attention to, was that third choice, where the information was presented very visually and graphically. So you do want to be aware of the fact that while many of us who are sort of staunch traditional journalism people really do appreciate the long form story, it's not where your highest readership is, and that's certainly something that's important in terms of the 21st century news model, is to make sure that people are keeping up on what you want them to look at. So let's look at some examples from the professional world. I have a whole bunch of these, and then I'm going to show you some that my students did over the course of the past year, and I'm going to try to breeze through them pretty quickly because I have a whole bunch of examples I want you to see. There are a bunch more in this week's folder, so you can take a look at some of those as well. And obviously, It's useful to build a Pinterest page, I think, based on infographics and alternative story forms. So you've got lots of good examples for your students to have. And in fact, some of these are from my own Pinterest page. So you may have seen some of them there. So really cool different ways to sort of arrange graphic information. You've got lots of food examples you're going to see throughout the course of this. Plenty of different ways to prepare a hot dog. Certainly something that I think people are going to look at. Not super heavy, but certainly fun and some things that people are going to want to look through. This is a great example of alternative story form on Nelson Mandela. Lots of really, really cool information presented in visual ways. You can take a closer look at this example in the folder. You'll see another version of that there. Pretty cool example using color, where we've got a really cool kind of color scheme that's been developed and lots of different information on Mad Men. Here's again, another, probably not one that your students would do necessarily, but this wine guide has got some cool visual clip art, and also has a nice job with the wine bottle sort of serving as a point of entry for the text. So that people sort of know how to start, where to start, and how to work their way around this page. You've got that cork sort of pointing to the headline, so lots of cool things happening here. Story about different types of bird food, I imagine, but this is the type of form, even if you're not going to do a bird food story. You've got lots of different examples of this type of thing where you see stacked information like this, and each of those pieces sort of representing something different. Really cool way to organize information visually. Here's another example. If you've got students on your staff who are really good with artwork, you may want to utilize that. We often, on our C magazine, you'll see some examples later of student artwork that gets worked in. It's the type of thing where I think you have to have a very talented artist in order to make this work. Your magazine or newspaper can end up looking a little too amateurish if you don't have someone who's really talented with this. But having a really, really good artist, you can definitely take advantage of that. Lots of different text kind of put together, serifs and sans serifs and bolds and narrows and different things that are happening here to allow people to sort of have a sense of how to read this in a really, really quick way. And you can tell that things are placed differently even though they're smashed together pretty well. Good example of proximity. Here's a great example of a large-scale graphic that kind of covers the whole page and then is used as sort of a diagram. The Lego thing is just kind of cool and cute and fun, but you also are able to cover some pretty serious topics and content, even using that type of graphic. I just love this. Not entirely sure what it says, but you've got a really, really cool example of a very specific large-scale graphic that's surrounded by smaller things. This is an example I talk to my students a lot about, the concept of stuffing your pages. You don't want them to be busy and hard to read and difficult to follow, but providing them, whether you're working on a magazine or a newspaper or a yearbook, but providing them with pages that students are not going to be able to just whip through super quickly, but are really going to have to take some time to digest if they're interested in that information. It provides them lots and lots of detailed information here, which is great. Cool different way to sort of collate information here. A very vertical design here, making use of the numbers and serving as sort of an alternative form calendar, which is also starting to become popular if you're advising yearbook. You're seeing lots of chronological coverage in terms of yearbook now, and this could actually serve as one of your dividers and do coverage this way instead. Here's lots of sports examples. In fact, I have a whole sports series of examples in Pinterest because I advise a sports magazine. I'm sharing these with my students a lot. Different visual graphic ways to utilize information. Sports obviously is very statistical based and stat heavy, so it's a great chance for you to really kind of think about how to organize that information in a really cool way. I thought this was kind of a cool, just very pretty simple, basic way to organize information in a visual way to give people a different look at a recipe. But basically that's all this is a recipe here for a smoothie, I think. There's a whole series of these, and you've got the ingredients all there and should be able to follow it from there. So pretty simple and straightforward. really clean, classic look. I like my students use this concept a lot with the one large graphic that bleeds off the edge of the page, and you don't even necessarily see the whole graphic there, and I think that can work really well. There's another concept that you see a lot, that sort of like build a burger concept, where they take the pieces and kind of split them apart and organize the visuals that way. This one's about how much salt content, I think, is in each of the pieces of this sandwich. So it gives you, a fairly straightforward but also serious and visually appealing way to kind of gather that information. This is a great example of a way to really organize your material in this sort of clothesline fashion, where we've got lots of different visuals across the top, all cutouts, but also those cutouts are bleeding outside of the boxes, so they're not necessarily just stuck within those boxes. You notice there's a reverse text across the middle to separate the visual from the text. And then that text, because you're doing that clothesline thing, doesn't necessarily all have to end at the very same spot. It's okay for that to be ragged across the bottom. There's an example here, a student example that another professor helped me find that was based on this one. So you take a look at this one, and then here's a student example that was done based on that same one. And you see that same concept, but with different types of perfume. So good example of a way that a student took a professional design and kind of morphed that into their own. Okay, so now I'm going to breeze through some student examples. I advise a couple of magazines in Palo Alto. One of them is C Magazine, which is really kind of tailor-made for this type of presentation. My students are doing some heavy-hitting stuff and some in-depth stories, but also a lot of self-contained spreads on, it's an arts and culture magazine, so spreads on music, food, that sort of thing. So you'll see a lot of those different examples. Some of them are text heavier than others, but what the idea here is to push you guys to the point where you're coming up with a design of your own that you can then create and share in a visual way. So these are student examples from the previous year's CMAG. Here's a story about SoundCloud and a couple different students who are students in our school who are on SoundCloud. So there's little personality profiles of each of them. A little more text heavy than you see some of the other ones, but we've got a really cool color pattern. She worked pretty hard on putting this together and developed probably 15 different versions of this before she settled on this one. And also a cool infographic in the corner. It's a gift-giving guide, pretty common. You see this quite a bit. Nice use of graphics. The sort of map chart where you've got a key and a series of numbers that coordinate to the visuals, I think, is a pretty common way to do this, and really turns out into a nice package. You see timelines quite a bit. Had a student artist who clearly is much more talented than I would ever be in terms of being able to do these visually, but then putting this into a sort of a timeline fashion, I think, is a pretty common way to do this. Just has a nice visual look to it. I mentioned before, lots of different food coverage. This was developed as a story that was specifically about this Rocco's Tacos and was going to be sort of a personality profile on the people that ran it, and then developed into a much more visual effect. So you've got some student artwork here, several different choices that you can get at this ice cream taco food truck, and just a nice clean package with repeated designs on the top and the side with those little lights that go across there. Recipe we did for nice cream. The student actually took a picture of, used the picture of the ingredients as the background of the left-hand side of the spread, and then worked those graphics into both sides of it so that they had kind of nice visual touches on top of that. Lots of cool layering here. She also created one of those super fast, tasty style videos to go with this that we put on our website that gives you an opportunity to actually watch the nice cream being made, and ended up with, I think, 4,000 or 5,000 hits on it. So I really did a nice job with the multimedia package on that. A story about making your own popsicles and different versions of that. Just kind of like the classic look here. Pretty simple and straightforward. Nice visuals and graphics. Good color scheme to go with that. There's another example of using the background of the page to actually take the photo. So this required a little bit of setup ahead of time because the students knew they kind of wanted to do this sort of pattern. And so taking the actual photo, they had to be thinking ahead to sort of where they wanted some of the words to go. So worked through a couple different things on this, sort of a marble pattern on the countertop that was used. And so you see that line kind of go through, which we worked through different ways of thinking about how to use that and not use that. And ultimately, I think this came out looking pretty cool. You see lots of comparisons like this. So again, that concept of just one large picture that's bled off the side of the page. And these are just two restaurants that are in the area that we're comparing different food atmosphere of those particular restaurants to getting, I think this is the type of thing that students really like to see, is that sort of review sense. Bay Area bread tour, lots of different places that you can fill up on carbs in the Bay Area. A nice color scheme here as well. Story about different types of chai tea. Again, a comparison. We like these sort of like, which one is better? So we've got the Village Cheese House sandwich versus the Driftwood Deli sandwich. And they picked a winner on that. Different spring recipes. I really like the color pattern that they decided upon with this, where you don't have a proximity connection between the photos and the recipes, but those colors allow you to sort of see which recipe goes with which picture. Pretty straightforward and pretty easy. I don't think there's any confusion on that without even having that visual connection. So really like this one a lot. This was a story about different places in Palo Alto that you could go for date ideas. One of them is this movie theater, and they actually took a photo of the marquee in downtown Palo Alto and then used that as part of their headline. So I think it was a pretty clever way to put that together. This concept, I think, worked pretty well. Visually, I think they got to a point where they wanted to do more with it and just kind of ran out of time. But in terms of the content, they really liked doing the survey version. And so would they ask questions like, are hot dog sandwiches? And then the results were basically sort of formed the actual size of the hot dogs. So really kind of a clever way. I think people really like this page as well. So then we have some music and some artwork type things. This was a story where we found yearbook pictures of old Kettering, or sorry, that's my old school, Old Pally alumni, and utilized those, and also told little stories about the musical artists that have been part of the history of our school over the course of the last 50 years or so. Each month we do a Artist of the Month, and this one was focused on a student who does ceramics. Not a photo of the student, but really focused on the work here that the student has done, and then a Q&A with the author that goes with that. A self-care guide, kind of a cool visual look using icons, which is kind of an in thing to do right now. Here's the first page of a package that was worked together in terms of zero waste living. So this was just a very straightforward, I really like the look of this, very simplistic looking intro page that goes with the two-page spread that follows, which looks like this. And then you've got some more of that really cool student artwork that works together. We had a teacher sort of suggest different things that she does with regard to actually thinking in terms of the environment, and put together some things like that to go with a more straightforward long-form story. Here's another version of a more in-depth package that we do. So this is another 3-page spread. This was on students and alumni who have chosen to serve in the armed forces. So here's this intro package. I really like this sort of ribbon metal thing, that strip that goes across the top that was utilized and then continues to be utilized within the package here with these 3 different personality profiles. So lots of really interesting, cool artwork happening here. One that could be pretty easy to be replicated in other places. This is do-it-yourself pins. This is actually a photo of a student who's on our staff who's really into pins. So they used lots of different pins and then kind of talked about ways to make their own. How to set up the perfect picnic. Nice color scheme here. I really like that. And we have interactive quizzes are cool things to do. So which Pally teacher are you? You go through and take the quiz, and that kind of tells you like which of the 4 teachers below you're most like. Again, those interactive things I think students really enjoy. Musical content as well. So we have the 5 most anticipated albums with different student artwork that's done for those. And this is a good way to kind of get around thinking about copyright things, is to just actually have, I'm sure you have talented artists in your school, use their talents to really kind of push the content and coverage in your magazine. Our students at the end of each year have established this tradition where they each take sort of a Polaroid style photo in a portrait studio, and then talk about the songs that sort of meant the most to them throughout the course of high school. And these are the students on our CMAG staff, the seniors, at the end of the year. We also do this CMAG Simplifies in each issue, which basically takes a fairly complex issue and tries to boil it down into a visual piece. So this is really tailor-made for this alternative story form concept. It's not a long form. It's going to be a short, brief example of exactly how to simplify a very complex issue. So this one was the drought, which is big news in California at all times. Here's one that we did in November, I believe, back towards the election, on the explaining the Electoral College. This is a one-page one on simplifying the concept of feminism, which I'm not sure how easily you can do, but certainly they did a really cool job of creating the visuals and kind of putting this package together. Okay, so you've got lots of examples here of different alternative story forms. There's lots more in this week's folders. You want to take a look at those. And again, your assignment this week is a little more, a little broader, a little less uniform and structured, because you get to pick the concept that you are actually going to design. So you obviously want to think that through first. What's the concept? What do I want to actually design about? Certainly feel free to use stock photos and photos that you find in other places. You wouldn't be doing this if it was an actual assignment that was going to get published. But for our purposes, since this is a design class, feel free to use pictures from other sources. But really push yourself to come up with something that you think is great. Looking forward to what you guys have to do. Thanks so much. We'll talk to you soon.